so excited. I've been wanting to do this roundtable for a very long time. So I didn't know you could do that with water tanks. Tank jacking, new roofs, unusual repairs, and more. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And one thing I love doing at the beginning of these roundtables is find out, let's talk to our audience. Let's find out what is problematic for them. What do they want to hear about and learn about? So I just launched a poll to our audience. So the question is, what repairs are you most curious about? And pick two of them. Pick two of them here from the list. I think we've got 8 total things. All sorts of different ideas. Some of them are major repairs, like putting a whole new roof on it, or if you're moving a tank, that's pretty intense, or also known as a re-erection. But then other things, some of them are a little simpler, such as fixing leaks. But I know Jamie, every time I have a client with a tank leak, I'm always like, Jamie, I send him pictures. I'm like, okay, what are my options? And then he goes through them all, and then he's like, you don't need it done like right away, do you? And I think I let you know, we just had one last Monday. I just found out about it, and the repair company came in this Monday and was able to weld a few patches on it. And as far as I know, everything's good. So sometimes you get lucky. And actually, the firm was only 20 minutes away from our client. So another 5 seconds for the poll, and then share the results with everybody. And okay, and poll, share results, and it looks like, ooh, okay, looks like the tank jacking, that was the #1 of interest. Second was fixing leaks. Okay, good to know. 2. And 3 and 4 was the cell carriers and a standpipe into an elevated tank. Okay, cool. Okay, excellent. So thank you so much to our audience for sharing your questions and what you're curious about with us. We appreciate that. As far as my panel goes, I'll start with myself. I'm Christine Gonzalez, Senior Project Manager, and for special occasions, Storage Tank Queen here at Entech Engineering. I've been doing tank stuff for 28 years, building, repairing, designing, inspecting, and now doing everything I can to help clients take care of their water and wastewater tanks. One of the reasons our panels are so great is we get a bunch of other viewpoints, because I could just pack this full of Entech people. In fact, Rob Horvat was supposed to be on our panel today, and unfortunately, he's out helping a client with a DEP inspection. So otherwise, Rob would be here. But we love bringing together other industry experts, our friends, people we work with, even our competition. It doesn't matter. We want to share information with you guys out there in the audience. So I want to start with Ralph. Let me do it. Ralph Wawrzyniakowski, and he's been on many of my panels when it comes to tanks. He's the engineering project manager from Pennsylvania American Water, responsible for maintaining 350 plus tanks throughout Pennsylvania. Jamie Stoltzfus, he's also been on several of my panels. So he is the field operations manager and estimator with IK Stoltzfus, a painting and rehab contractor focusing on tanks. I've known the Stoltzfuses for 28 years. And in fact, it was like my second week at Fisher Tank, bidding on a job, and they're like, oh, call up Stoltzfus, they'll give you a price. And I remember it was John, your dad, or your uncle, Jamie, and he's asking all these questions. I'm like, I'm new, I don't know anything. So they've been around a very long time and are awesome at giving information and helping our industry. Joe Hoban is the vice president of Dixon Engineering, and they do engineering and inspection services for the coating industry. And he's been at this for 22 years. And Dave Cull is a structural engineer with Caldwell Tanks. In the past, he's also worked at TIC, but what's amazing is he has a total number of years of experience, 51. So I really wanted to do this roundtable to pull together the guys who've been doing this a long time and have so many stories, in fact, probably forget more than they remember. So let's just jump right into the first topic. So our audience said they were very, very curious about, it was tank jacking. So I'm going to, what we ended up doing was, my panel was very helpful in sharing photos and other information with me. So I'm going to share a couple slides with you so you get a sense of what is this tank jacking thing that you're talking about. You may have never heard of it. So it's a really, really cool option if you've got tanks and want to either need to raise the tank because you need a bigger hydraulic gradient, or you just want some more storage. So I'm going to share my screen and show a couple photos of what we're talking about. So these are a few pictures I'd gotten from my friend Robin Davis at Fisher Tank Company. What we're looking at, there was actually, I think, 2 tanks in Pennsylvania. So in the background, you can see that light blue tank. And right now over on this side at the manhole, they're actually cutting out a bigger plate so they can get in and out. So it's a reservoir. It's about 16 foot high. And to do a tank jacking, you're essentially adding a ring at the bottom. The way welded steel tanks are designed, they've got thinner shells at the top, thicker at the bottom. So if you're adding shell rings, you need to add thicker ones at the bottom. And here on the left-hand side, you can see those hydraulic jacks all connected to the shell, and they raise the tank all at the same time, raise it up. And in this case, they raise it up 6 feet. You can see the gap there. And then new shell plates were welded in place there. So that was that particular tank jacking. This is one I had done it. Was it a Fisher? No, I did this one. Maybe it was Fisher. Yeah. And I took this off of Google Maps. Standpipe. You can see it from the turnpike in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. They wanted to add, I think, 2 rings, so 16 feet, needed to be at the bottom of the tank. But what's interesting with the standpipe is you've got to do a bunch of extra stuff, which is zooming in here. Down at the bottom, not only install new rings at the bottom and jack it up, but here we actually put in really interesting stiffeners. So there's about every 10 feet around the tank, there's sort of buttresses or connectors, I guess, steel, and they connect to an anchor bolt that was out here. And in this case, the foundation, we had to make it bigger and more solid so the tank couldn't turn over with wind loads or earthquake loads. And then this last photo here of a tank being raised. This is one that Joe, you had shared with me. You want to tell us what's going on here?
Yeah, this was last summer, no, the summer before that. So this one started at the beginning of COVID, so that was a whole different, thing to deal with. This is in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. They were developing part of the city, and they needed more water pressure, so they needed to add 30 feet to the riser of the tank. So what they did was lift it all up in one piece. Actually hit it on the first day, which I know that's something, when you're dealing with wind and weather and things like that can push it back. And I didn't look it up. I wish I did, but I forget what the weight limit on that crane was, because it was a pretty big operation. You needed a crane to set up a crane in order to lift the tank. And that is just the tank hanging there. It just kind of looks like an optical illusion. So it's very interesting to watch. And so then they lifted it up and slid the other piece in and had a small audience around, neighbors.
The other piece would be slid in here. So what's another 16 feet of the riser slid in there?
It was 30 feet of riser, yeah, and then packing away with the JLG to start welding it into place so they can, got it all done in one day. I mean, setup took a whole day and take down the day after took a whole day, but they got it ready to go in one day, and it was quite an operation to get going, and it was an interesting project to be a part of.
That's amazing. So help us out. What other when you're considering doing a project like this, what do you have to think about?
I think we actually work through another engineering company, and I'll blank on it as I sit here, but I'm sure that they went through the whole thing about an entire another tank, getting rid of this one and adding another tank, leaving this one. So we don't necessarily do all that, but I know there's a lot of considerations. And I think one of the considerations, and I don't know the details on it, was whether or not the developer was willing to probably put money into it, because I'm sure that it costs a lot of money, and they need to have, if that person needed 10 PSI additional pressure that I'm sure they were part of the financing of the whole project.
Yeah. Yeah. So on that particular job, what was Dixon's role on that? Were you out there for the inspection side of it?
Yeah, we did the weld inspections, and then actually after the contractor got done raising it, they had a separate contract. So then they put containment on it and blasted and painted it. And if you go back to that photo, they actually took some antenna stuff off. They had a pod, the pod and the mini monopole extension. I just saw it there in the bottom left-hand corner. Took that off, so they put containment on there and rebuilt the handrail. I know those were some other photos that I had sent you for a different tank, but so then once it got raised, he had a second contractor, second contractor under a separate contract come in there and blasted and painted before they put it back into service. It was an option for the one contractor to do it all, but it got split up into two different contracts. So it was a all summer project, and so we were involved on the paint project or paint inspections at the end after the welding was done too. So we were there for quite a bit of time. So very my first time seeing it. I mean, I've seen it on videos and YouTube and things like that, but to be there, and I know you've probably been there where you're like, oh, I'm going to watch this, and then it's too windy, and the next day you can't make it. So I've missed out on seeing some of these things go live, but luckily I caught this one in 2020.
Yeah, and something pictures tell a whole story. So you can see the cranes here. We can also see one antenna pole. So perhaps
actually a second one.
Yeah, temporary.
Two of them there.
Yes.
Yeah. Had to get them off for the whole duration. So that's one thing, if you ever deal with it, you got to make sure you get started on that 6 months, maybe even 12 months before you even couldn't raise a tank, let alone paint a tank. And I know a lot of projects that they get to the point where they think they're going to start having considered the antennas and pushes it back an entire year or more, because there's a lot of considerations on coordinating the antennas before, during, and after the project for these type of for painting and or welding and raising a tank.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. With the cell carriers, no matter what you're doing, well, if you're painting a tank, blasting and painting the outside of a tank, raising it, doing anything like this, so important, 6 months ahead of time. Got to notify them, got to know who you're talking to. Don't just send emails, talk on the phone the old-fashioned way. Make sure you get the right contacts and talk through, okay, how is this happening? Who's paying for it? Can you stay on the tank, or you got to get off? So critical. So we've already got a question from Nick O'Halloran. Hi, Nick. He's with Entech out in our Pittsburgh office, and he asked, do you know what the total project cost was for that elevated tank riser installation? So that was the photo I had shared, the one on Pennsylvania Turnpike where they added 2 rings to it. Nick, I'm old. I don't remember such things, but I do know, actually, Kim Mazer in our office for Entech, he just recently looked at jacking a tank for a client of ours, big reservoir. And here's what you got to do as an engineer and as an owner. You got to look at your options. You got to look at, do we raise it? So get budget pricing from a few clients, but then you also have to know what you're doing. So do you need to change the foundation in any way? All the different accessories on the tank, how are they affected by adding new rings? You have to block off manholes if they're up high and add new ones down at the bottom. New anchor bolts. Is the piping, do you have to change that in any way? The overflow needs to be extended down, the ladder. So all these different things to consider with the tank jacking, and then come up with that price. And then consider, do we want a new tank in a different location, or what's entailed with that? Do we want a new tank in this location, or what's entailed with that? So I know Kim Mazer went through various scenarios to determine what makes the most sense cost-wise for this particular client. So there's never, and every tank's a little bit different. And sometimes you don't even have the information you need to do a tank jacking. So I'm curious, Dave, have you been involved in many of these tank jackings?
Typically, you look at the cost of jacking a tank and all other things to consider, taking this tank out of service for a period of time. you have to go back and you have to know enough about the existing foundation, whether it can support additional height, additional wind loads, additional seismic loads. And a lot of times, people come and say, well, we want to raise the tank 30 feet, 40 feet. Those are really not practical. And you have to go back and ask yourself, are we serving our clients best by raising this tank? I mean, all the things considered, or would we be better served building a new tank that meets our specific needs? And that's usually, generally speaking, 8 or 10 feet. Yeah, that's worth considering. A lot, much more than that, you really need to, your foundation becomes a significant cost. And a lot of times those costs will far exceed, replacing the tank.
Yeah, that's very good guidance. But as I said, worth the exercise of going through and just really talking through what are your options? Why do you want to do this? I'm curious, Ralph, have you guys ever gotten involved in any tank jackings?
We actually did 2 years ago in our Elwood City location. We built a new water treatment plant, which then changed the hydraulics of the system as a whole. So one of our tanks that was basically controlling the system, our water treatment plant would watch it to regulate the pressure in our system, was now on the opposite side of the system from where it was originally. So a tank in between the water treatment plant and that tank would see higher pressures. So what we did is during a scheduled rehab, we got a cost to jack the tank and add, I think it was 18 feet of height to it. And as Dave said, there's considerable costs to that, right? You have to upgrade your foundation. The tank is usually pretty old, so you'll want to update your valve vault and take care of any piping changes that you may want to do while the tank's out of service. And then you have the full rehab. We found it to be cost effective as opposed to building a new tank, but that's probably not always the case. So we had a very successful project, and now the tank's been in service for probably about a year and a half, and it's operating parallel with the tank on the opposite side of the system and keeping the gradient in a nice happy mode all the time.
Excellent. Now we have another question, or back to Nick O'Halloran, just so I'm not leaving you hanging. If I go back in my mind, like how much did it cost to jack that tank? I'm gonna throw out $800,000, but that was 15 years ago. Memory's not so good. There was an analysis done, new tank versus jacking it, and typically it's going to be like. Do you remember, Ralph? Like if I go in and just round numbers, typically if you're jacking it and it's like 75% of the cost of a new tank or less, then it's probably worth it because you're saving a considerable amount of money. What do you think?
Yeah, we found that it was essentially comparable to the cost of rehab, or close to the cost of rehab. So it almost doubled the project cost. And we found that the same, we had to replace the roof on a tank before. And again, very similar. And it's because of the manpower, because of the steel costs, because of the labor. And right now with steel being at an even higher cost, you may find that to be an even wilder decision to make, right?
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting over time, whether is it labor cost or steel cost, or like what's changing, and things are constantly moving. Have you seen that, Ralph?
Yeah, I have. And I see Damien asked the question in the chat that, and we found it to be effective to raise the tank during rehab, during our rehab window. But I guess if for some reason that tank was just repainted and we changed the hydraulics of our system, we would probably have wanted to raise that tank, when we needed it, right? But if it's practical to wait until a rehab window, I think that makes the most sense. That way you can have somebody like Jamie come out, after the tank jacking company comes out and just paint it at the same time, because it's already out of service and those new rings are going to need to be painted anyway.
Yeah, and something to keep in mind for our audience, you may think, oh, let me just hire a guy. Well, it's sort of like when you're doing general construction, there's specialty people. So someone who does the tank jacking is not necessarily who does tank repairs, not necessarily who does the painting. So you may end up with a few contractors out there. Do you remember, Ralph, did you have a couple contractors, or was it all under one big contract for this?
We had multiple contractors. So we had the tank painter that I think was our general contractor. And then they got bids to jack the tank itself, and that was a specialty contractor. And then there was also a third site contractor that did piping work and valve vault work and replacement of a few valves on the site and removal of some old pipe, things like that. So I would agree. You act as your own general contractor in some circumstances there.
Yeah. Just a shout out. I see Robin Davis. Robin, are you there?
I am here.
Okay, I can't see you, Robin. Where's your pretty face?
I'm surprised it didn't want to let me on, and now it won't accept my won't start my video for some reason. I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah, and you're welcome to turn it off and turn it back on again. That sometimes works. But Robin, I had shared the photos you had given to us for the tank jacking. Any sort of basic rules that you guys follow when it comes to jackings? How do you know if a tank is viable or not?
Well, typically it helps a great deal if you have existing drawings of the tank, and one of the big questions that comes into mind when thinking about jacking a tank is what the foundation is that it's setting on now. It is possible to
It is possible to, and now we can't hear Robin. Okay. Just to follow up with Ralph, you helped key in with Damien, and our audience had a question. When raising a tank, do you want to wait until you're repainting it so you can schedule everything at once, or is it something you can quickly do? So I'm curious, Dave, what's your experience with the jackings? Is it normally tied in with the repaint, or does it really vary?
Usually you would tie it in with a repaint. We mentioned earlier was, the tank's already out of service. One other consideration is what is the condition of the existing tank? Does it make sense to raise it? If there's significant corrosion, let's say the roof is bad, maybe there's some other issues. Maybe all those things factored into it says, gee, we should be building a new tank rather than attempting to rehab this one.
Yeah, good point. So critical, have a recent inspection report that looks at everything and knows, are we in good shape? Like my favorite tanks to jack are actually the older ones. So ones in like the 70s and older, because you actually have a lot thicker steel. That was before Appendix C or Section 14 or whatever. Let's use the thinner steel, but it's higher strength. I like the older tanks. You got a lot more steel to go with. And granted, I've never done a check on that, but just gut feel. I like having thicker steel. Jamie?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention when you guys were talking about when the appropriate time for painting, we actually coordinated with a project, possibly with Fisher. I'm trying to remember which tank builder, but we actually painted. We painted an 80-foot standpipe, and then they jacked it 40 feet. And then we painted the bottom 40 feet. So we actually, part of that had to do with the winter and when was a good time to paint during the year and when was a good time for them to do work. But part of it also had to do with access because, painting an 80-foot tank was an easier project than doing a 120. This was a standpipe. And the foundations were massive that they poured around the outside. I was pretty new back then, and it was very impressive to see.
Yeah, so essentially, if there's a ring wall or slab, what they end up doing is digging out around the outside edge and putting new steel into the old foundation and then pouring a new section. And it all has to be calculated and designed to make sure it's withstanding the right loads. So another question from our audience. This comes from Pat Burke from Entech. He asked, it makes me laugh, how feasible is it to jack bolted tanks? And I'm thinking, isn't that the way they're normally built? Like bolted tanks, they are jacks. So they already use this technology and have the jacks. Ralph, have you ever seen that done for any of your tanks?
Yeah, actually, most of our new bolted tanks are built exactly like that. They build the top ring first, and then they jack it, and then they put on the next ring, and so on and so forth. So I would imagine it's just as feasible. Knock on wood, we haven't had to raise one of those tanks yet, but I'm sure it'll happen one of these days. So I would imagine it would be probably easier to do that than it would be for the welded steel, but I would guess pretty comparable.
Yeah, and I got a client actually. All these come together. Jamie, you patched a tank that did have extra rings added to it. It was a bolted tank. So yes, Pat, possible to do it. you got to go through all the same sort of calculations and analysis, just like with a welded steel tank. But Joe, how about a concrete tank? Can you jack a concrete tank?
I haven't seen that. I'm not sure. I'm not from the bottom up, not the same way, I don't think.
I'm thinking no way in hell, but hey, if anyone from DN Tanks is out there, let us know. Dave, you ever seen anything like that?
No, I haven't. That doesn't sound very fun.
Okay, let me check and see if there's any more questions out there. Okay, and so spend some time now with jacking the tanks. So I hope that gives our audience a sense of, hey, this stuff is possible, and always something, spend a little bit of money, have some people run some calculations for you. Make sure, important to get drawings if you have old drawings, and always know the drawings done by the engineer are not the tank drawings. You need the drawings done by the tankie themselves. So Caldwell, CB&I, and if you don't have them, a lot of these tank manufacturers, it's cool, they still have, records. A lot of them have records and information about the old tanks and can share them with you. So to really, I always love whenever a client needs something, well, from Fisher Tank, because I still know the guys there. So I'm able to get in to their an archive with a bunch of old stuff, which is really, really cool to look at. So I love doing that. The next point that the audience was very interested in learning more about was tank leaks. So I'm going to share the screen again and share a few photos that these guys had shared with me. So share screen, and here we go. Okay, this first one, you may have seen this photo on LinkedIn, and it's a client who a week ago said, help, my tank is leaking. And what really sucks is when it's during the winter time, it gets really bad. So we're looking at an old riveted tank. This is about 100 years old. It's elevated, so it's up on lattice legs. I think it's about 100,000 gallons. But you can see it's not easy to get to where this leak is. I mean, the ladder's over here on the left-hand side, leaks over here. But we've called several contractors, got 3 bids. They had to figure out a way to safely get up there, and then it's like, how do we patch it? So the contractor who went out there, thank God they were local. Here's what they saw in the shell, a couple holes through it. And keep in mind, this tank, well, the plan is to trash it. It's gotten 100 years of service, but the owner wants to build a new, larger tank in a little different location, but we just need to get this one through a couple more years until the new one's built. So we didn't care how they repaired it, just fix it so we can keep the tank full of water. The contractor came out, found, I think it was either 4 or 6 little holes in the shell. And keep in mind, when a tank hasn't been repainted, there's corrosion on the inside, and you really just want to find some good steel, some steel that you can weld to. So they ground down here. You can see a couple spots where they power tool cleaned it, got rid of the old paint, and then welded a few patch plates on. And the owner was able to fill it up later that night, and so far so good. Haven't heard anything. It's always tricky when you're working with riveted tanks, because any welding you do near it, applying the heat, can affect these riveted joints and cause more leaks. So far so good out there. This may look familiar to you, Jamie. I love this tank. So this is a client of ours in central Pennsylvania. And Jamie, I know you went out and took care of fixing this one. So what was, this sort of looks like a bee's nest, but what is this repair you did there?
Yeah, I think, I believe what we used there, we put, because the condition of the steel was so poor, it was very difficult, and the location right next to a gasket, flange joint with a gasket, I believe all we did is tack weld a plate over it, and then we used a urethane based 100% solids product and basically troweled over that to create a seal after hand or power tool cleaning. Okay. But yeah, the fear was if we welded a patch, we would melt the gasket and then just create a bigger leak right there at that joint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and no, even though you see these seams here, even though they're all bolts, there's a difference between riveted tanks, which was that last photo we saw, and bolted tanks, which is what you're seeing here. A lot of the repairs and ways you do things are the same, but can be a little bit different. So it's important to recognize the differences. So this is another bolted tank. And Jamie, take us through. This one was also leaking here. This is actually behind an overflow bracket, right? Is that what you had found there?
Yeah, apparently something had gotten stressed at one point, cracked the coating. And so what you're looking at there is the original hole, the original bolt hole. Right below it, a crack and corroded area. And then what we did is use stainless steel nut set to put nuts captive in the shell, and then bolted over top of that a plate with a gasket and a sealant.
And then you just seal the heck out of it, don't you?
Yeah, it's these kind of repairs I would call temporary permanent.
But it's interesting because this is a bolted tank for one of our clients. We had Mid-Atlantic come in this past summer. The tank was actually, there was two of them. These are the ones that were, they did have, I think, 40 feet of rings added. So they were originally 80 foot high. Both of them had another 40 feet added after like 20 years of service. Let's see, they've been around like 40 years. So these bolted joints, the sealant should be replaced every so often. So they came in and did that. But I said, hey, can you go? We want a new plate. This is just a temporary repair. Give us a new plate for this. And they're like, you know what? The repair Jamie did, phenomenal. That will last a long time. It's keep it. Just keep it. Don't worry about replacing the plate. So I thought that was very, very interesting. So curious out there in our like panelists, what's the hardest leak you've ever tried to fix or been involved in? So Dave, what have you seen out there? What do you find to be the hardest leaks, or like one you never were able to fix or hear about?
Well, with a welded steel tank, you can typically drop the water level a couple of feet below the leak site and make a welding repair, fill it back up, and put it back into service. As far as difficulty in repairs, the ones that access, especially in the wintertime, cold winter, on the underside, especially a leg tank or a single pedestal tank, the underside surfaces of the container are difficult to get to. And with the weather, it makes it even worse. I'll share a brief story. Had a tank that the customer called and said they heard this loud boom. They weren't sure what it was. And then they looked and they said, gee, we think one of the legs has failed, and it had split open. So, our concern was as far the people, anybody close to the area, and they said, yes, there was a house within about 70 feet of the tank. So we asked them suggested that they move while we effected repairs, and they reluctantly declined. And when our crew was there performing the repair work, we learned that they had a business interest. They had a still in their barn and they couldn't leave their business. So that.
Oh my.
Too funny. I love it. The rest of my panel, tell me your leak stories. Anyone have good, interesting ones? Ralph, you're in. Go ahead, Joe.
We just had one, I think it was in September, on a fill and draw pipe inside of a spheroid where they was punching through the insulation. So we went out there, and it was about 20 feet above the bottom platform. So we were able to hang from the ladder and cut all the insulation off, and found a sketchy looking spot and scratched it down, and was able to stick the screwdriver in there. And then we came down and showed them the picture. So they had somebody come in there and patch it. And then they filled it back up, and sure enough, another one popped up further up. So they asked us to go back, and I spent about 2 hours. It was in October, and I was sweating because I was in there cutting the insulation and just letting it fall, because they wanted me to check the whole pipe. And I found one other spot I could stick my needle nose pliers into. And then, but I saw so many other spots that looked sketchy that it was like, we gave him a recommendation to replace the whole thing, or an estimate to replace the whole thing. And actually, haven't heard back from him on that to see what he did on it. But yeah, I think like that's when you're patching some of those, you might just like plug in the dam. You might just push it to some other spot that's compromised, and eventually the whole thing. And that was really an old tank. I don't think the tank was built in the 80s, but a lot of them. But that was the other question that he asked is, could I line it from the inside of on the inside of the fill pipe? And I really didn't know I have an answer for them. So that might be some, I don't know if anybody's ever seen that, but it's the second one I've seen since this winter where it was a fill or draw pipe or both that was leaking and really difficult to repair and not chase the problem up somewhere else.
Well, you said trying to line the inside of a fill or draw pipe. Like, how do you get in there to do it?
That's what he was trying to find different options.
Yep.
I said I'd never heard of it, so we didn't do it. That's why I think he was just frustrated with it. That's we haven't been back there, because when I gave him my estimate, I think he says, we accept your bid. And I said, that's not my bid. That's just an estimate for somebody else to hopefully come in and do it for that much. And knowing that the steel prices have gone up, it probably was even low. So we probably should have just added, 25% to everything, like just to try to be more in the ballpark when they do come in. But the whole thing, our estimate was almost, and it was a 16-inch pipe for over 100 feet, and trying to get it. I mean, I think it was $75,000. So none of that is cheap. Maybe it was even more than that.
That's a good price. That's a good price.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why he wanted me to do it for that much.
Now, Jamie,
I
I know
do it
about
for $75,000.
yeah.
Yeah.
Jamie, every time I have a leak, you're the first person I talk to. So tell us some leak stories. What have you seen out there?
When you asked about most difficult, we came into a job that was part of a rehab, and the tank had history of leaking. But I think what the original problem is the fill. It was a common fill drain, and that pipe came through a gland type fitting. And it was a little hard to tell, chicken or the egg, which came first, but something started leaking there, and then it washed out onto the floor. And I think we dealt with a job like that for out in Western PA, I believe, with you guys. But that's not the job I'm talking about. There's actually another one, and the floor had sagged so badly that I think it took multiple efforts of re-grouting and then actually replating most of the floor and then grouting between the two plates to solve that. And that was all, it was major work, and that was all the result of, from what we could tell, either from original, it wasn't backfilled right, or, a leak causing the whole underside of the tank to wash out, and then the floor was unsupported. And I think the diameter of that tank was like 68 feet. So, it was a very large tank. I think it was a little over 2 million gallon tank. So that was probably one of the most difficult repairs. Now, we did it not as an emergency repair, but part of a rehab. But we have some similar stories to Joe's as far as finding leaking riser pipes, and sometimes they're worth fixing, and sometimes it's just a full replacement.
I'm curious.
Yeah, I like that.
Have you ever had one, Jamie, where you're afraid the tank's going to fall down on you?
I don't think so. Okay. We were replacing some sidewall plates on a tank where we ended up replacing the whole bottom 2 feet of the tank, section by section removing. So that was one where, you had to be careful how much you took out. But, as far as actual fear of something collapsing, I can't say we've run into that.
Okay, good. How about Ralph? Tell us about your tank leaks.
As a company man, I will tell you that our tanks just don't leak. I don't understand. We never get leaky tanks at American Water. No, we've had quite a few, and obviously everybody can tell you they always seem to pop up when it's 10 degrees outside, and then I'm calling Jamie or I'm calling another contractor, and and it's snowing or freezing rain or sleeting on these guys when they're out there trying to tell us what's going on and what happened. Common culprits over the last couple of years are fill pipes to elevated tanks. We've added a lot of expansion joints to those where they connect to the elevated tank, and that seems to help a lot, because where that weld connects with the elevated tank, we've had a lot of issues where welds crack and we have water pouring down the inside of an elevated tank. And so we've kind of combated some of those. And then also the riveted or bolted tanks near the seams. A lot of times those bolted tanks have thinner steel than a welded steel tank. And we find that near the seams, especially, we'll get leaks, whether it's from some sort of a mixer that's on the inside and then ice is still building up and causing something to rub and then causing a leak over time, or something breaks off like a ladder bracket or something like that and causes a leak, and then it just develops over time, to give us more problems. I actually am going to steal Jamie's couple solutions that he sent you on the two that you spoke about earlier, because those looked like some nifty repairs. So I would say those are probably the two biggest culprits lately, is the fill pipes and then the thinner steel near bolted areas.
Okay. Help me out with those riser pipes. You said you put in new expansion joints. Is that?
Yeah, like an expansion joint. You'd have to put in a flange and then an expansion joint on there, and then that lets the pipe move a little bit when the tank shifts, whether due to temperature or whether just to do a little bit of motion, and that seems to really have stopped the welds from cracking. So it seems to help.
So are you saying those tanks were built without an expansion joint?
Correct. Yeah, they're older. Either they're older or somebody value engineered it out of there. It depends on what happened, but you live and you learn.
Yeah. So Dave, you design tanks. Tell us about expansion joints. What did you guys always have them as part of riser or in and out inlet outlet pipes in your elevated tanks?
The expansion joints have changed over the years. Originally, the expansion joints were a mechanical joint with a packing gland with them. They had a jute packing and then a packing gland. So over a period of time, they would leak. So now we're using either the rubber, the elastomerics, or we're using the stainless steel bellows type joints. Typically, you can figure, these tanks will, you have some elastic shortening of the pipe. You have, when you build these tanks and fill them full of water, they shrink minusculely, but there is some shrinkage, and your expansion joint takes care of this. And what happens is you have a welded joint, a fixed welded joint, and they will flex at that joint. Eventually the paint fails, and then you'll end up with a leak. So the expansion joint minimizes this potential.
Okay, very helpful. The thing that I always enjoy doing with my panelists, and anyone who's been on my roundtables before knows about something special that I love to do. And so a few people know this is coming. However, the rest of the people don't. So we're going to play a little game right now. And I'm going to share my screen. So it's a little game that I'm going to call Who Built It? So if you've been in the tank industry for a long time, you can, first of all, most tanks have a nameplate on them, a nameplate, so you know who built it, gives you information about it, but sometimes the nameplates have fallen off, or for some reason there isn't one there. So a question to our panelists, I'll run through each of you and tell me how or who built this particular tank for North Penn Water Authority. It is a little bit tricky, but who built it and also how you know it. If you actually have no idea, you can make up a story, and at the end our audience is going to I'm going to poll the audience and see who they believe, see who they think should be crowned Tank King based on what your knowledge is of tanks. So I'm going to start with you, Ralph. Ralph, who built this tank and how do you know?
Ooh, that's beyond my years of expertise. As the young guy on the panel, I'm gonna be the one that says I don't know.
Oh, okay. So you're being honest. You're not going to make something up. You can make up.
Correct.
Jamie, who built this tank?
Oh, I don't know, but I'm gonna guess Caldwell because they're on the panel.
Okay. Caldwell. So then that's just sort of a guess. Joe, who built this tank?
I'll say it's McGuire Iron because that's the only other one besides Caldwell that I can think still builds leg tanks.
Okay, that's a good guess. Okay, Dave, who built this tank?
PDM, Pittsburgh Des Moines Steel,
Why do you say that?
handrail.
And what do you see in that handrail?
The configuration of the handrail, the W shape of the diagonal bars,
Yeah, what about it?
PDM.
Okay, so there's some interesting guesses. So I'm going to poll our audience and check and see who do they believe? Who do they think provided the best answer here? So I'll give you about 10 seconds for the audience to think who out there, who knows what they're talking about, who should be anointed Tank King. I need to get a Burger King crown so I can send it out next time we do one of these challenges. So this is something interesting I learned because so often I look at a tank, I'm like, oh, I wish I knew who built it. Well, because as I said, you can go back to the tank manufacturers and often they still have files. So CB&I, when I reach out to Dan Knight and his people there, they often have them. I think it's like $300 or no, they charge by the page, by the sheet. So it's like $60 a sheet. It's invaluable information sometimes when you're rehabbing or want to do a special rehab like some of the ones we're talking about. So another 5 seconds for our audience, and then I'll end the poll. And we will see who is king, who will be crowned the king. I will share the results. And congratulations, Dave. So you clearly know your tanks. And if we go back to that photo for just a moment. So Dave had noted this handrail. And actually, the trick question is, you can also see there's like a mid rail here, a mid rail. So that was added during the rehab. There's also a top rail here. That was also added during the rehab. This is one of my babies. So there's OSHA rules and regs for these handrails, and the older handrails, usually back in the 80s or before, don't meet OSHA. So you can either replace the handrail or upgrade it. And what we're looking at, share there we go. So with these tanks, this one, you can also see it's got the up and down. So I always think it's sort of like an M, the letter M, and you see up and down, that is PDM who built that. Dave, what do you see X's like this? So the handrail has X's. Who built it?
I don't know. You're putting me on the spot here. I don't know.
The X's, I believe, is Chicago Bridge and Iron.
Right.
Okay.
And then the last one, Dave, do you know who does the upright ones? So Dave, I think, isn't it Caldwell? Or no, I'm sorry. Is it Advanced or Caldwell who does upright ones? Or what does Caldwell do? What do your handrails normally look like in the past?
This would look like a Caldwell handrail. This could also be railings on newer tanks, because we have to meet the OSHA requirements, you have to have the mid rail and the top rail. So could be Caldwell, in other words, and some of the other manufacturers as well.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it's particularly what we usually see. It's the older tanks where there was only a couple manufacturers doing these things. Talk to an old tanky; they can usually help you identify who built it. So now there's a trick you guys all know. Okay, and congratulations to Dave. I will be sending you your crown very shortly.
All right.
If anybody here would have tried to take that from Dave with his experience, I think you would have had a big argument from the rest of the panel.
Thank you.
Okay, so to cover one more topic in a little bit of depth, one of the questions from the audience, I double checked the polling results, and they'd asked about cell carriers, and they'd also asked about it was moving tanks, and essentially re-erecting them. So it's cool. I was out at a job site last month. I'm going to share 2 photos with you and then see if anyone in our panel has been involved in any of these. So share my screen. So what I ended up seeing was, this is an elevated tank, I think around 100,000 gallons. But it's interesting because when you look closely, first of all, this orange thing, I'm still not sure what that's about. I need to talk to Harold Peterson because I know they get involved in re-erects. So I'm not sure what happened there. But if we zoom in closely on this, what you can see, it's odd. There's this one weld ring. So when you see dark marks, and this is all just soot and silt on the side of the tank, dirt, but there's 2 weld rings, 2 welds right next to each other. And up here, 2 weld rings. And if you go down the riser pipe, there's also odd weld areas. That indicates the tank was built somewhere else. The owner either decided they wanted to move it to another location in their distribution system, or occasionally you can find tanks for sale. Tanks for sale, you can buy them, have someone re-erect it for you, repaint it, and put it back in service. And I mean, that's one of the cool things about these welded steel tanks. They can be re-erected. You weld on you cut on a different seam and re-weld it, because the weld seam itself is very, very strong, and you don't want to mess up that area. So usually about a foot over, you'll cut and then re-weld it when it gets back into the new location. So curious, Dave, have you been involved in many cut down and re-erects for the tanks?
Typically, working, with a new tank manufacturer, the largest component in a cut down re-erect is the field labor. And that is the most expensive, costly part of it. The other issue that comes to the front is you have a tank that's available, but is it the right height? Is it too short? Is it too tall? Does it make sense to relocate it? Also, tanks were relocated more in the past before we had concerns about the lead paint. There are tanks, not many, but there still are some tanks are setting that have lead paint on them. So your cost of abating the lead becomes significant. It makes it almost impractical from a cost standpoint to cut down a tank and relocate it.
Yeah, so those are some of the important things to consider. Similar to jacking a tank. Look at all the different various options and really understand what is required to do it. Ralph, do you know if any of your tanks in your system were re-erects?
We try not to, because we find it not very cost effective, at least when we've analyzed it previously. By the time you put in a new foundation and the piping, and you pay the labor to demo a tank with demo with enough integrity to reuse, right?
Well, carefully demo, because yes, right. You have to mark. It has to be thought out well, so it's small enough pieces you can transport it on the road, but as big as possible, so there's less weld seams, right?
Right, and by the time you do all of that, it's usually cheaper to demo without that integrity and just build a new tank on the new foundation you're going to create anyway. And then you call somebody like Dave up and you say, "Hey, Dave, can I get a price for a new tank, please?"
Thank you.
Now, Joe, have you gotten involved in any re-erects like this?
I don't think I have, but I just was thinking of that in the last couple of weeks there. I got to review all the reports that come through, and there was one where I saw that where it was re-erected, and then I was talking to our project manager later, and he was complaining how it still had lead paint on it, and they had moved it, and I won't say who it was. I won't even think off the top of my head, but they had moved one and sold them one with the lead paint on it still. So yeah, that can that's a factor. But I haven't seen one get done, but I just was thinking about that when I saw your picture on one I had seen that was moved somewhere over at some mobile home park or something over in Michigan that I just looked at recently.
Yeah, we're lucky we're at a time where lead from most of these tanks, I mean, because granted, welded steel tanks typically are painted inside and outside every 20, 25 years or so in general. So, and lead became a real issue in the early 90s, I believe. Would you agree with that, Jamie?
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah. So at that point, I remember going to these meetings and everyone's up in arms of, oh my God, it's going to triple the cost of painting these tanks. And the owners don't have the money, because essentially with lead, there's all these safety precautions you need to take, containment to contain the lead dust. Where do you dispose of it? But over the course of the past 25 years, the painters have all figured it out, and typically most of the time do the job basically the same way, whether there's lead or not. Just disposal that may be a little bit different or a little bit more costly. So costs have come way down, so it's way less of an issue than it ever was in the past. However, if you're the one touching the lead paint, there's OSHA rules and regs, and some contractors, they just turn their head. And it's sad, because it means the workers out there, they're the ones being exposed, and they may not even be aware. So Jamie, any re-erects in your past?
We've painted a couple that we, could tell that were re-erects, but we weren't part of that process. There were ones that, I know one was a standpipe that was adjacent to a railroad track, and the story was it was brought in on rail car in very large pieces. And so that, kind of makes a little bit more sense where you could transport it like that. But yeah, not something we've seen a ton of.
Yeah, okay. Yeah,
I think I 3 tanks in 20 some years, so
Okay.
not very often.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to, is there one available that's exactly the right size and height for you? And how often does that happen? Because so often if someone doesn't want a tank, they haven't rehabbed it, they haven't kept it in good shape. Ralph?
Yeah, the re-erects that I've been thinking about lately, that we've been considering, I guess I would say, is temporary storage re-erect. So we purchase a tank from like a Mid-Atlantic or something, one of the glass line bolted tanks, and use it as temporary storage during a tank rehab, and then move it from project to project. Now, we haven't done that because, again, you still have to build a foundation for it. You still have to have some sort of a hookup to it and things like that. But that's something I think, owners may want to consider in the future, doing something like that while they're rehabbing their existing tank. Or you call somebody like Jamie that has some temporary storage options, and you use those in addition to or instead of, a temporary tank of some sort.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. A couple comments and questions from our audience. Patty K, she says that she knows about a tank, or there was a tank involved with an oil spill. So this is not water, but oil spill in Ashland, Pennsylvania. It was a steel welded tank that was relocated. So it was a re-erect. 1 million gallons of oil went into the the Monongahela River in the dead of winter. If you guys remember this, Fisher Tank actually got involved in helping to write rules and regulations in Pennsylvania. If you're doing anything with fuel tanks in Pennsylvania, you've got to be Pennsylvania certified builder, inspector, painter, all sorts of rules and regs on that side, on the fuel side. So yeah, that's a mistake that can happen when you're doing a re-erect. So it has to be done right, and welding in cold weather can often be very, very tricky as well. Going back to the leaks for just a second, Eric Moore from our office asked, has anyone had a leak repair gone wrong? And what could the cause of that be? So Jamie, any repairs that just couldn't get it fixed?
We've had some that we were not able to seal 100%, but typically, we go in it with the intent to keep the tank online. If we're doing an emergency repair, our intent is make sure the customer doesn't have to take the tank offline. So there's been some repairs that, we could get it down to 99.9% of the leak was fixed, but there's still a little wet spot there. But yeah, so we've never had anything catastrophically go wrong though.
Okay. And a reminder to my audience, anyone out there, if you've got questions, comments, please share it with us. We'd love to hear from you. Kevin Gallagher from Caldwell, and he says, I believe lead paint was outlawed in 1978. So the percentage of existing tanks that have lead has been increasing steadily ever since then. And granted, there was still some painters who, had lead paint in their storage areas through the 80s. So they still want to double check even based on that. Let's see. I do see Chris Cope had asked a question. Is there any new tank material or technology on the horizon? So that seems like a huge, broad-based question. But Ralph, when it comes to storage tanks, what are the different materials that you guys typically have for yours?
Sure. So most of our storage tanks are either some sort of a concrete or in-ground storage tank, welded steel, glass line bolted, or bolted and riveted. And that's typically what we've been seeing. As far as I know, we haven't gotten involved in any other technologies for larger sized water storage tanks outside of those. If it isn't broke, don't fix it, right? But we stick to those, and they've worked out really well for us.
Yeah, good policy. Okay, I'm going to run through some of the other photos that the panelists have shared with me. So some of these other repairs, we've got another 15 minutes or so, but let's go through those and hear a few more stories about what is possible out there. So looking at new roofs, this is one, I'm going to throw a thank you out to MBA. I worked with them and they kindly share their photos. So this was some 2 million gallon water tank. I forget where it was, but the owner couldn't take it offline. These are roof rafters. So we're looking at a dome roof. Roof rafters were shot. We figured, okay, we'll have to replace 40 of the rafters. Turned out all the rafters were shot. And when the painter started painting it and blasting it, it just was falling apart. So option, replace it. Replace the roof with an aluminum dome roof. And you can see it was built adjacent to the tank here. And then big crane came in, lifted it up, put it on top of the tank. And also, typically you need to add some sort of stiffener ring at the very, very top of the shell as part of this upgrade and rehab here. So pretty cool project. So instead of replacing it with an identical steel roof, do an aluminum dome, save money on, you don't have to repaint it anymore. And Joe, you shared this photo with me. So Joe, what are we looking at here?
Yeah, this is a 2.75 million gallon standpipe, and the roof was shot, so they decided to put a new steel roof on. And I haven't been on it too many, but I've seen reviewing reports, a lot of the geodesic aluminum dome roof. And I was just thinking about that on this one. I wasn't part of the decision when they went with steel over that. Yeah, that's the same one. And it's old riveted tank down there on the bottom. And I think the steel at the bottom is like 2 inches or something like that. And it's still like 1 inch at the top. So maybe it's 1.5 inches, but it's a pretty substantial tank. So they put a new steel roof on. You can see the old one there in the bottom right-hand corner. They cut it up and actually got it on just at the end of last year in our Wisconsin winter. They couldn't get it fully painted, but they put it back online, and they can take it back offline for a couple weeks this upcoming year and finish it off. So it was an interesting, very interesting. And I actually had to go to the shop of the company that was building it. General Construction, they're up in Somerset, Wisconsin. And when I was at the shop doing weld inspections, they had, I'm going back a little bit, they had some old tanks for sale, or tanks they could re-erect. They had a whole bunch of parts and pieces back there. It was kind of interesting to me being a tower guy, looking around like at the store buying tower pieces, but that was an interesting part of that. But yeah, this was just replaced last year, and not cheap deal, you know, as everything goes.
Well, it really speaks to maintaining your tank. If it's steel, you know, you got to paint it regularly, inside and out, not just the outside to make it look pretty. But you just made me think of something. With the internet now, there's all sorts of, just Google used tanks, and who knows who's got a website set up or who's selling used tanks. So there's probably a lot of good stuff out there. You just need to make sure it's, you know, in good shape, have someone inspect it with you beforehand. And Jamie, you shared this photo with me. So this is a big ass diameter water tank. Tell us more about it. And here we're going to zoom in a little bit. We can see some handrail on the ladder. So what are these rusty spots here?
Yeah, this was a tank that apparently experienced some severe corrosion on the roof sheets at one point. And between the roof rafters on the interior and the roof plates, there was lots of little pinholes. And so when we abrasive blasted it, we found all those pinholes, or blew through them. And then these are all patch plates. I think those plates are like 6 inches wide or something like that.
And they're mainly around the outside edge. Any sense of why they'd be concentrated around there, or have you already painted the center parts?
No, it was concentrated around the outside. The only thing, I think the overflow height was really high on this tank. So the water level was very close to this. I don't, I don't think it was submerged, but very close.
Okay.
So that's the only other indication I can think of.
Okay. Yeah. So in this case, didn't need to replace the roof. However, when you get thin plates, patches are needed. So whenever we're bidding rehabs, always throw in metal repairs. The inspection report will give you a sense of what you're dealing with, and then experience for how many hundred or how many thousands of dollars you want in metal repairs, just either lump sum or get some unit pricing from the contractors. And leaks, we did the leaks section. And what else do we have? Cell carriers. Okay, cell carriers, the bane of our existence, right, Joe? So tell us, what are we looking at here, Joe?
That's the after of the
That's the after.
before.
Okay, what was it before?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So this, go one back there.
Okay, yep.
So yeah, so that has a pod in the center and the mini monopole extension, and you can see on the bottom right and the bottom left, they had these like 6 or 8 foot fence pieces, I called them. So, and those were out away from the edge, so they weren't really safe to access without ropes. Anyway, they go back to the one with the welders. That we got all the pod off there. That's the pod. You can see the fence pieces there. They did have a painter's rail out there, so you could access it, but there was nothing real safe about the situation. So on most tanks where we have pods, we're trying to get rid of them if we can, and install the handrail. So that first picture, that was me flying up in the JLG with the welder, Jerry Newland, if anybody knows him. I think he's retired now. He was probably around even before Dave's time, but anyway, they made the roof a lot safer. They were able to reinstall the antennas on that handrail that was there. We made it as big as possible and safe, and just to increase the safety of working on that tank and climbing around once you get out to inspect your vents and screens and those type of things.
Okay, excellent. Cool. Logos. So this is something near and dear to my heart. This is on my bucket list to go see the Earthoid. I believe it's Gaithersburg, Maryland. Has anyone on my panel, anyone ever seen this live and in person? Anyone? No? Oh, do you know what? Let's do a field trip. We'll do a drive down. We'll do a tour of it. So this is actually the second time the Earthoid has been painted. So it's essentially a spheroid that's on the ground. I think it's next to a college campus, and something really cool you can do with your tank. Ralph, you shared this with me. So what is that?
That is an elevated storage tank up in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, which, as many people know, that's where the groundhog Punxsutawney Phil resides. So if you've ever driven through the town of Punxsutawney, groundhogs are everywhere. They're on every corner, on every storefront, anywhere you can imagine a groundhog, that they'll put it, whether it's a statue or whether it's on a water fountain or on a logo, it's there. So 2 years ago, we repainted our water storage tank right next to the hospital in Punxsutawney, and it had an old decrepit logo of Mr. Phil on there. So we got a nice new updated logo, as you can see on the right. And now it's proudly waving at not only the hospital, but the rest of Punxsutawney. So a very successful project, and we had a lot of fun with that one. Phil even came out for a little bit of a ribbon cutting ceremony.
No, really? Really?
Yeah, when we put the tank in service, we got Phil out there, and I got to meet him and say hi to him myself. And after this winter, I don't think I would have as many kind words for Phil, but at the time, it was a really cool thing.
Very cool. Do you want a question from our audience? Came in from my friend Tori Morgan. So she says, so tanks that have creative painting, pictures, logos, is that normally donated? Is there a crazy cost involved with that? So Ralph, what do you guys normally do when it comes to logos?
Yeah, so from an owner's perspective, if it's a case-by-case basis, right? Most of the time when we're putting our logo on there, that's at our cost. And then if there's another logo that wants to get put on, it's usually a company decision whether we are okay with it or not, and then who shelters that cost. So there's really no tried and true methodology there,
Okay.
and when you add something small to your logo like that, it's usually not a huge cost when you look at the grand scheme of repainting and rehabbing the entire tank, especially it was funny you mentioned repairs gone wrong. And I believe it was at this tank several years before we painted it, there was a small leak in the bottom of the bowl there. And the repair company went up in a JLG lift and they did all the safety checks on the lift and everything. And it turns out a hydraulic line failed while they were up doing the repair. So they couldn't get down from the lift. It was just stuck up there. So they had to get the fire company out there to help them down and get them off of there. So that was the only quote unquote repair gone wrong. And I said, ironically, they're right next to a hospital. So, if there's a better place for anything to happen, it would be there. Now, nobody was hurt or anything, but it was just one of those weird things that happens.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I see we're up against our time. There's still some more slides I have with repairs and stuff, but in case anyone does need to leave, I want to share just some information about our panelists and some upcoming roundtables. So if you enjoyed today and want more, we've got one more scheduled so far, Wednesday, March 9th. That's on water regulatory updates. So we've got a bunch of panelists coming back who had been on our last one. So always good to know what's going on with rules and regs for water. Coming soon, we'll have stuff with wastewater as well as funding. So if you're interested in checking out either current roundtables that are on our schedule or past ones, we have recordings of all of them. Go to our website, www.entecheng.com. Across the top, you'll find resources on the menu and drop down to roundtables. You can also see future Entech presentations. March 22nd through the 24th is Pennsylvania Rural and State College. We've got Entech folks giving 7 classes on water and wastewater. If you were there last year, there's these really, really cool trading cards you get with all your favorite tankie and engineers. Also, April 6th, Southeast Pennsylvania AWWA, WWOAP Spring Meeting in Exton. So there's 2 different presentations we're helping out on. Got Natalie O'Connor and Tori Morgan speaking on finding funding, what source is right for your project. They're also teaming up with Penvest to speak about that. And I will be leading a roundtable live and in person, so excited, on supply chain issues. So huge thank you to my panel. If you want to reach out to any of us, you can see we love talking about tanks and repairs and fixing them. So thank you so much, Ralph, for coming back. Love hearing about your tanks there for Pennsylvania American Water. Jamie Stoltzfus, one of my favorite tank painters and repair guys, thank you. Joe Hoban, loved hearing your stories from Dixon Engineering. Robin Davis, I'm glad you could chime in for a moment. And big thank you to Dave Cull with Caldwell. So if you're interested in a PDH certificate or the operator CEH, there is my email address. You are welcome to send an email over to me and I'll be glad to get that to you. I'll leave this up for a moment. But panelists, if you guys can still stick around for a bit, I'd love to go through a few more photos, and also any other questions from our audience that we didn't get to. I see Kirsten from our office. She said Germantown, Maryland. That's where the orthoid is. So anyone wants to road trip with me, let me know. Would love to go there and check it out. Let's see, a question from Damien in the audience. So he says, when it comes to adding an aluminum dome roof, could there be a concern for galvanic corrosion when adding an aluminum dome roof to a steel tank? So Jamie, I know you've done that in the past. What's your experience been with that, steel or aluminum sitting on the steel?
Yeah, I believe in that situation. There was a bearing material, like an insulator, so to speak, but it was like a very thick plastic material, and then I believe the bolts were all protected as well, to isolate with isolation flanges.
Okay, so and has anyone else had experience with that? Okay, yeah, because I think typically, yeah, that is the way you can do that. So yeah, and just so people in the audience know, it's that dissimilar metals whenever the two are touching it. Granted, when it comes to galvanic corrosion, Dave, you probably know a lot about it, and Joe, To me, it's a mystery. I can't really see it. It's invisible, but I know it's bad. And Dave, what have you seen with that?
Those aluminum roofs, you have to put on a wind girder on the tank because the steel roof actually, keeps the tank round and keeps it from buckling in the wind. So you have to put in a wind girder. But then on top of that, each of the manufacturers of these aluminum roofs, they have bearing pads, slip bearing pads that are the insulators. So you don't have the dissimilar metal contact.
Good point. Thank you. Okay, do you know what? Let's go back to the photos, spend another 5 minutes or so and just run through a couple we didn't get to. So when it comes to logos, this is a fun one I did with North Penn Water. What you'll see over here, there was an existing tank, ended up designing and building a new 250,000 gallon spheroid. And what's really cool, oh my God, look, on the left, which is real and which is the mock-up. So important if you are doing a logo, doing any sort of writing on your tank, do a mock-up ahead of time, please. You can see this one, we went extra big with the letters to make sure it looked good. And actually this is great because we had to get zoning permission. So everyone had a sense of what it was going to look like ahead of time. And here's a tank tip, tanklogos.com. Tanklogos.com, the guy there will do mock-ups for you with exact sizing and colors and everything. And then the painter knows exactly what they need to do out in the field. Well worth it to make sure it's right in the design phase. Because occasionally you can end up with something like this. This is a beautiful new tank built locally and it's got the town name on it. Can you read the town name? It upsets me because this could have been beautiful and the logo should have been 5-10 times the size it was. So mock-ups, do a mock-up ahead of time. It can make sure it looks beautiful. So turning a standpipe into an elevated tank. This is an oddball thing I found in a magazine a few years ago. So Moses Lake, I think it's out it was out in the Pacific Northwest. This is the tank afterwards. What was that? So tank afterwards is over on the left-hand side, but they ended up adding some new rings, doing a new roof, but this is one they turned into a standpipe. Really, really cool. So if we're looking inside from the floor looking up, they put in a new floor with framing here on the underside, new riser pipe, and then you can see the inlet outlet pipe actually goes in through that dry riser and then up and into the tank. Really, really cool. So it can be done. And we actually bid a job. Owner had a tank, wanted to turn it into an elevated tank for 2 reasons. Actually, 1 reason. So many of these tanks are so big now and water quality, you got too much storage. So we wanted to put a bottom in halfway up. So this would involve changing the foundation, bulking it up a bit. And then to just have an elevated portion would involve putting a new bottom in here. You can either make it rounded or flat, or in this case, you're going to do a cone shaped one. And we got a couple of bids for that. So a couple ideas there. If you're moving and re-erecting, we had talked about this one. And so that was it as far as the additional stuff we didn't get to. So I'm glad we had time to run through everything. So wrap things up with my panel, and thank you to the audience for sticking around for a few additional photos and stories. Any final words of wisdom? Dave, anything we didn't cover that you want to share with the audience?
Most controversial thing in any tank project is what to put on the tank and what color to make the tank.
Excellent point. And here's a suggestion, like, don't give anyone an option. Do what they did last time, or do what all the other ones are colored, because you're right, that can take months and months and delay projects. So I love that tip. Joe, any other tips, things we didn't get to?
No, I agree with the less people involved on the logo and color too. They'll invite everybody and put it in. So the less hands that goes through, the better. Mm-hmm. No, I guess if you are working on tanks, climbing on tanks, be safe, and it's a whole nother topic, and so there's a lot of stuff that goes into all this to make it work, and that everybody goes home at the end of the day. And I appreciate the opportunity to be on.
Oh, my pleasure. Jamie, you've been doing this a long time. Any other words of wisdom that you can offer to our audience?
Yeah, I think kind of touching back onto leaking tanks. Often, not always, but often it is an indication of a trend. You know, typically a leak isn't a standalone event. So often it's a sign that your tank is in need of maintenance, whether it's on the fill pipe and the whole fill pipe needs replaced, or, you know, if it's in the side of the wall, you know, maybe there's a bunch of spots of corrosion on the inside that you can't see. But yeah, I guess my tip would be pay attention to those leaks and get your tank inspected.
Excellent advice. Thank you. And Ralph, any final words of wisdom?
From an owner perspective, make sure you have a very good toolbox. So have contacts when something does go wrong. So have somebody like Joe from an engineering and inspection perspective, and somebody like Jamie from a coatings and repair perspective, and somebody like Dave from a new tank perspective. Having all of those in your contact list helps. And then also do yourself a favor and follow AWWA guidance. So inspect your tanks regularly, 3 to 5 years is what is recommended. And do yourself another favor, and please don't always make it an ROV inspection. It'll help you practice taking a tank out of service, and dry inspections will let you get a better inspection, and then also wash out any silt or debris and disinfect and improve your water quality. So those, from an owner standpoint, would be my tips.
Oh my God. Do you remember one of the last times that Ralph was on a roundtable with us, we actually took a blurb of how long does it take to rehab your tank from start to finish, including DEP permitting. We made it into a little blurb because phenomenal information that most people don't know because you don't do this stuff every day. See another special little clip coming out featuring you, Ralph. So
oh no, you know what? I need to start practicing these ahead of time if that's going to be the case.
No, because then you'll be all self-conscious and then you'll feel like you need to have like slides and stuff. This is awesome. Thank you. So huge thank you to our audience. Wonderful questions. I appreciate them. Thank you to my panelists, Dave, Joe, Jamie, Ralph. You guys were marvelous. I love sharing tank stories and hearing your experiences. And I always wrap these up by saying magical things happen when you bring together passionate people. You guys are all clearly passionate tankies, just like me. So I love you all. Have a great day, and we'll see you soon. Bye, everybody.
See ya. Thanks.